Before the 9th century, music existed entirely in the moment. A song was performed, heard, and immediately vanished. Every melody relied entirely on human memory to survive. By the year 800, Charlemagne had conquered a massive expanse of Western Europe, but his Holy Roman Empire was fractured, divided by dozens of regional dialects, cultures, and local traditions. To bind these disparate populations together, he turned to the Church. He decreed that every citizen across his empire must pray the exact same way, by listening to the exact same music. This mandated music was plain chant. It required a monophonic texture, a single, unified melodic line, moving in small, conjunct steps, and sung exclusively in Latin. This diagram shows the 4 legal scales of the empire: Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. These scales formed a rigid, mathematical framework dictating allowable pitches. A singer could not deviate. Boundaries ensured no personal embellishment altered the melody. Early medieval sacred music served a specific administrative purpose. The strict uniformity of the chant erased regional identity, transforming the daily act of worship into an instrument of imperial control. Yet an empire spanning from modern-day France to Germany faced a severe logistical limit. Without a way to record audio, teaching the exact same chant to thousands of distant monasteries required years of traveling emissaries. This manuscript reveals the solution: neumes. These strokes and dots placed above the text merely suggest the melody's shape. By adding horizontal staff lines, scribes locked those floating symbols into place. Distant choirs could finally read the exact same pitch. By committing sound to parchment, musical notation trapped the human voice in a physical medium for the first time. Once music was written down, it could be held, studied, and analyzed. Musicians no longer had to rely entirely on memorization, freeing them to experiment with sound as if it were a physical object. Between the years 900 and 1300, this experimentation led to the development of polyphony. This diagram shows how early polyphony functioned. Instead of a single line of melody, singers stacked additional voices simultaneously at specific intervals: perfect fourths, fifths, and octaves. This vertical alignment created harmony. It was a complete departure from the flat, monophonic plain chant mandated centuries earlier. As compositions grew more intricate, the creators behind them began to sign their work. We see this shift in figures like Hildegard of Bingen, an abbess whose distinct, highly documented visions resulted in complex, recognizable compositions. By the late 12th century, this complexity reached its peak in Paris with the Notre Dame composers, led by Léonin and his successor, Periton. Inside these cathedral walls, Léonin and Periton structured overlapping vocal layers with the same mathematical precision and immense scale as the Gothic arches above them. The Church had commissioned written notation to enforce strict uniformity. Instead, they gave musicians the exact tools needed to build towering acoustic structures that defied that original control. Between 1100 and 1300, the musical literacy carefully guarded within monastery walls leaked out into the broader population. Composers began applying these advanced harmonic techniques to everyday life. They wrote secular music concerning human romance, political struggles, and local gossip. The mandatory Latin of the Church was replaced by the vernacular languages of the people. Songs were now written and sung in regional French, German, and Spanish. The artists who authored and performed this music, the troubadours in southern France, the trouvères in the north, and the minnesingers in Germany, carried these localized songs across the continent. This movement incorporated instruments into the performance, moving beyond the strict limitations of the unaccompanied voice. Alongside the plucked lute and bowed vielle, musicians utilized sackbuts, shawms, and recorders. This physical hardware expanded the textures available to a composer. We know the names of hundreds of these secular musicians, from Bernard de Ventadorn to Adam de la Halle. The era of the anonymous, state-mandated servant was over. The notation system, originally engineered by the empire to constrain the human voice, gave people the means to record their own stories. The technology designed for control became the blueprint for musical freedom. Prior to the 1400s, the sonic baseline of Europe was defined by a single texture, narrow, monophonic plainsong, sung exclusively in Latin. This music was an unyielding monolith, constructed entirely to echo the divine. Its structure omitted the individual human perspective. This rigid restriction was physically hard-coded into the way music was recorded. The ancient square black notes, locked on to red staff lines, dictated a delivery that left no room for expressive variation. Medieval music functioned as a strict architectural tool meant to access the divine, rather than a form of personal expression. In the 15th century, that foundation cracked. Humanism emerged as a cultural force, pivoting art and literature toward the celebration of the individual and the emotional. This created a structural conflict. If the existing musical system was designed to suppress individuality, how do you channel human emotion through it? Modification was not an option. The system had to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up by a new class of sonic architects. Dismantling the medieval monolith was a necessity to create a space and sound for the human experience. The era's primary innovation was polyphony, breaking a single melody into multiple independent voices. This expanded the vocal range into a structured hierarchy of soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Through imitation, composers engineered these melodies to echo and chase each other across the choir. Chief architects like William Byrd mastered this mathematical soundscape, moving the focus from anonymous chants to named creators. By stacking these independent ranges, polyphony allowed listeners to track individual voices moving through a vertical and horizontal grid of sound simultaneously. As technical complexity grew, the focus shifted from the church to the secular world, seen in the rise of the Italian madrigal and the French chanson. Composers developed word painting, a technique where the physical structure of the notes illustrated the lyrics. A rapid tempo might be used to portray joy, while sudden, clashing notes could represent physical pain or distress. Through these techniques, music was permitted to exist purely to reflect and entertain the human condition. Word painting linked the note structure directly to the literal meaning of the human text. Vocal complexity soon required the support of physical instruments, leading to the development of specialized ensembles. The whole consort was a unified group featuring instruments from the same family, such as these recorders. In contrast, the broken consort mixed different instruments, lutes, woodwinds, and viols, to create a varied, textured sound. In 1501, music printing debuted in Italy. Mechanical mass production permanently replaced the labor-intensive hand copying of the monasteries. While the broken consort integrated diverse voices, the printing press provided the means to distribute those voices to a continental audience. By 1600, the printing press had transferred musical knowledge from the exclusive control of the clergy into the hands of the public. This printed music shows how mass distribution required standardizing notation so it could be read by musicians across different regions. This standardization allowed musicians separated by thousands of miles to recreate the specific emotional intent of the composer with precision. Standardizing the physical score was the final step in turning music into a reproducible mass medium. The Renaissance had completed its architectural work, layering harmony, perfecting the vocal choir, and establishing the emotional resonance of instruments. The vastness and complexity of this built musical space stood in stark contrast to its narrow medieval origins. The foundation was solidly built, and the rules of harmony were codified. The period of structural experimentation was complete. This structural foundation set the stage for the dramatic spectacle and theatrical intensity of the coming Baroque era. The Renaissance proved that human emotion could be documented and explored with the same structural rigor previously reserved for the divine. For a century, the Renaissance musical ideal was a study in balance. Composers favored voices layered in polite symmetry, creating a sound that was structurally perfect but emotionally guarded. But the 17th century was rarely balanced. Outside the chapel walls, life was chaotic, unpredictable, and governed by sharp, public outbursts of feeling. This created a vacuum. Listeners began to seek out a new kind of music, one that traded mathematical poise for the messy, volatile reality of human experience. To fill that need, music evolved. It stopped being a private, spiritual meditation and became a high-performance tool designed to trigger specific, visceral reactions. This shift reached its turning point in Venice. In 1637, the city opened the doors to the world's first public opera house. By moving performance out of the private courts of the elite and into a ticketed theater, music was suddenly subject to the demands of a paying audience. Composers adopted the doctrine of affections to hold that audience's attention. The rule was simple: music must be engineered to dictate one overwhelming emotion to the listener. Musicians began using specific intervals as psychological triggers. Rapid, jagged rhythms simulated heat and fury, while slow, dissonant chords forced a state of mourning. This wasn't just a change in style. The composer had become an architect of the senses, building elaborate structures specifically to control how an audience felt. To reliably produce these emotional results, composers overhauled the foundational mechanics of how music was written. They developed the basso continuo, a driving, continuous bass line that acted as the rhythmic anchor for every performance. Played by the harpsichord and cello, this bass line functioned like a heavy chassis. It kept the musical structure grounded while forcing the momentum forward. Because the bass line provided a rigid foundation, the melody above it was free to take dramatic risks. Looking at the manuscript, you see the contrast. Lower staves are sparse and regular, while upper voices are crowded with dense, ornamental flourishes. This mechanical split, a locked-down foundation supporting a volatile surface, became the primary engine for Baroque spectacle. To realize these complex compositions, musicians needed more than just a new theory. They needed a hardware upgrade that could physically handle the increased demand for volume and agility. Craftsmen in Italy perfected the violin, giving it a piercing tone and vocal-like agility. These instruments cut through crowded theaters with a sharp, clear resonance. This coincided with a move toward well-tempered tuning, a recalibration of the musical scale that connected all 12 notes into an unbroken circle. This change allowed a composer to travel through every musical key in a single piece, exploring a vast range of emotional shades without the instruments sounding dissonant or out of tune. With these technological leaps, musicians finally had the precision tools required to command the emotional atmosphere of a large public hall. These new tools culminated in the concertato style, a method of composing that focused on musical conflict. In the concerto grosso, a small group of soloists is forced to defend their melodic ideas against the massive, overwhelming weight of the full orchestra. Composers like Vivaldi utilized terrace dynamics, sudden, jarring drops from loud to soft, to simulate the shifts of a physical struggle. The soloist had to display extreme technical skill to be heard over the collective noise of the ensemble. This musical battleground mirrored the competitive energy of the era's public squares and opera houses, where individual success depended on cutting through the crowd. For some, this struggle to be heard over a crushing collective weight was not a metaphor. It was a literal fight for survival. Joseph Emedy was kidnapped from West Africa and enslaved by Portuguese sailors in the late 18th century. He was later pressed into service in the British Navy, spending years trapped within the rigid and often violent machinery of a global empire. But Emedy carried the era's most advanced musical technology with him, the violin. He used his mastery of the instrument to navigate the systems that sought to silence him. His talent was so undeniable that after being discharged in England, he rose to become the leader and primary soloist of the Truro Philharmonic. Emedy's life is the ultimate embodiment of the era's music, a singular, brilliant voice that successfully thought through the noise to assert its own humanity. The Baroque era left a permanent mark on the history of sound. It proved that music could be structurally engineered to hold an audience in its grip. It transformed the musician into a public figure, a virtuoso whose individual skill was now the primary draw of the performance. But the relentless pace of the basso continuo and the heavy layers of ornamentation eventually pushed the limits of the ear. The music had reached a peak of ornate complexity, a state of high artifice that was becoming too dense and overwhelming to continue. By the late 18th century, the sensory overload reached a breaking point. It set the stage for a new movement that would strip away the dramatic excess, in favor of logic, order, and absolute clarity. By the mid-1700s, the dense polyphony of the Baroque era was being replaced by a new priority. The Enlightenment favored clarity, order, and a sound governed by logic. This shift was accelerated by the rise of a middle class with disposable income. This new demographic began to demand access to the arts, which were previously the exclusive domain of the aristocracy. Historically, art music was performed in settings like this: small, elite, and highly exclusive aristocratic private chambers. To meet the new public demand, performances moved into massive public concert halls. This relocation introduced a technical challenge. The intricate string arrangements designed for a palace parlor often disappeared in these cavernous environments. There was also a structural challenge. A diverse public audience required a musical language that was accessible and transparent, rather than a collection of specialized inside jokes. To survive in the public sphere, classical music transitioned toward a standardized, legible structure, a ratio of reason. The definitive musical tool for this rational age was the string quartet. Using 2 violins, a viola, and a cello, the ensemble modeled Enlightenment philosophy by giving 4 distinct voices an equal role in a balanced conversation. To organize this conversation, composers established a specific architectural blueprint, sonata form. This created the central tension of the era. Could the complexity of the human experience be organized within a perfectly symmetrical mathematical box? Sonata form was more than an aesthetic choice. It was a method used to organize emotion into objective, predictable logic. The structure begins with the exposition. 2 contrasting themes are introduced, like opposing characters in a debate. In the development phase, these themes break apart and recombine through deliberate conflict. Finally, in the recapitulation, the themes return, altered but locked in perfect harmony. This rigid geometry forced composers to find creative innovations within highly restricted boundaries to maintain the audience's interest. This 3-part structure provided a mathematically consistent resolution to every emotional conflict introduced in the music. The instruments of the Baroque era had inherent limitations. The harpsichord plucked its strings at a fixed volume. Because volume was binary, composers could not use pressure to indicate nuance or build gradual tension. Bartolomeo Cristofori addressed this with a mechanical innovation that changed the instrument's physics, the touch-sensitive piano. By replacing the plucking mechanism with felt hammers, the instrument responded to the player's touch, allowing for variable force. This allowed composers to write smooth volume transitions, building tension through crescendos and fading into silence with diminuendos. The piano injected human expression into the strict mathematical framework of sonata form. Joseph Boulogne, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, mastered the era's structural logic while navigating its social restrictions. Boulogne was a champion fencer and a musical virtuoso who demonstrated a complete command of the period's most complex forms. He utilized the highly accepted framework of the classical symphony to integrate his own heritage into the center of European culture. By weaving Afro-Caribbean rhythms into his symphonies, Boulogne proved that standardized European forms could hold voices from outside their traditional boundaries. Boulogne did not need to abandon the era's rules to challenge its limitations. He achieved integration by mastering the very logic the establishment valued most. Masters like Haydn and Mozart combined the piano, sonata form, and structural logic to bring the era to its technical peak. They successfully established a universal language of balanced, geometric sound. This level of standardization created a unique challenge for those who followed, as it left the system with no obvious areas for further refinement. The classical era provided a framework so complete that it practically invited its own destruction. In the years following this period of perfection, a young Ludwig van Beethoven began his career. Beethoven examined the symmetrical architecture of sonata form and chose to test its structural integrity. He utilized the rigid form to frame unpredictable, volatile movements that pushed the music toward its absolute breaking point. The era's legacy lies in the precise boundaries it established, boundaries that future composers would use as leverage to pull the system apart. Before the 19th century, classical music operated on a system of polite, mathematical ratios. It was a style built specifically for the aristocracy, mirroring the rigid symmetry of the palace ballrooms where it was performed. Within this order, the composer occupied the role of a hired servant. Their primary task was to produce a steady stream of pleasant background noise for royal courts. But the arrival of the Industrial Revolution shattered this quiet. An explosion of steel, coal smoke, and massive societal shifts replaced the aristocratic order with a new, gritty reality. The old musical rules were too delicate for this environment. They could no longer contain or express the raw intensity of the modern human experience. To give voice to this era, the composer transitioned from a polite servant into a defiant hero, an artist who required a much louder, more powerful instrument to be heard over the noise of the factories. The modern orchestra didn't grow in a concert hall. Its expansion began on the factory floor. Industrial manufacturing provided the tools needed to scale music to a massive new size. Mechanical engineering was applied directly to instrument design. Complex valve systems were added to brass instruments and extra keys to woodwinds, granting musicians access to notes that were previously impossible to play. New massive instruments were engineered specifically to punch through dense walls of sound. The tuba and the saxophone were birthed from this industrial need for volume and weight. Even the piano was reinforced. Foundries began casting massive internal iron frames, allowing the instrument to withstand the brutal physical force exerted by the era's virtuoso players. By the late 1800s, the orchestra had transformed into a complex industrial machine, often utilizing over 100 performers at once. This technological race wasn't just about volume. It was an effort to engineer a machine capable of broadcasting the absolute extremes of human emotion to a mass audience. Composers utilized this physical power to develop program music, using orchestral textures to tell epic narratives. The software driving these stories was chromaticism. A traditional 8-note scale multiplies into a dense 12-note chromatic scale, providing a massive injection of musical data. This new dissonance and friction allowed composers to weave supernatural themes and darker psychological tension into their scores. Navigating this level of technical density required a new type of leader. Controlling 100 musicians playing complex chromatic lines turned the composer into a singular master architect, a role epitomized by the superstar persona of Richard Wagner. By embedding narratives within these symphonic structures, composers demonstrated that orchestrated sound could directly manipulate the emotional state of the masses. Because the industrial orchestra was now the most powerful cultural megaphone in the West, it became a strategic tool for broadcasting identity. Sidelined groups seized this massive scale to force their own narratives into the public consciousness. Figures like Samuel Coleridge Taylor and Florence Price used the weight of the symphony to force the classical establishment to acknowledge the Black human experience. Female pioneers like Clara Schumann and Margaret Bonds proved that the technical mastery required to command the industrial orchestra was not an exclusively male trait. These composers fused their own folk traditions and spirituals with advanced chromaticism, creating globally recognized works that challenged the existing cultural hierarchy. By the end of the century, the hero archetype had been decentralized. The industrial tools of the orchestra were now being used by anyone with a genius to command the machine and demand visibility. This era of extreme expression eventually triggered an unsustainable arms race. To remain relevant, composers felt compelled to push for even more extreme, boundary-breaking emotions. This relentless pursuit of the infinite made harmonies increasingly unstable, heavy, and dissonant. Music finally reached a breaking point. The foundational rules of the Western tonal system could no longer support the weight of the extreme chromaticism being forced into it. What followed was a systemic collapse. The musical machine had become too big and too heavy to sustain its own traditional rules. By pushing the orchestra to its absolute limits, the Romantics destroyed the old order. They fractured the mirror, leaving music in the unpredictable, rule-breaking chaos that would define the 20th century. For centuries, the European classical tradition operated under a strict set of rules. The 19th century Romantic orchestra was built on predictable cadences, rigid symphonic structures, and a comforting tonal center. But the turn of the 20th century abruptly brought an era of rapid industrialization and terrifying global conflict. The neat mathematical resolutions of the 1800s were psychologically inadequate to express the anxiety of a world tearing itself apart. To document this fractured world, composers began to fragment the music's internal logic, moving away from a single set of rules toward a wide variety of competing styles and techniques. Claude Debussy took the first swing, blurring musical reality by ignoring strict structural forms in favor of what critics labeled impressionism. This opened the door to free dissonance, a technique that stripped away the comfortable harmonic resolutions audiences had expected to hear for centuries. Arnold Schoenberg took this concept to its extreme, pioneering a radical approach known as atonally. In a traditional scale, every note pulls towards a central home key. Schoenberg dissolved that hierarchy, leaving notes floating untethered with no gravitational center to resolve to. This deliberate lack of an anchor perfectly mirrored the psychological displacement of a generation navigating the aftermath of a world war. As the mid-century approached, the primary cultural driver shifted from global conflict to mechanical and digital acceleration. Composers like Steve Reich embraced these mechanical concepts through minimalism, utilizing a process known as phasing. By substituting beats for rests, two players maintaining a constant pace are forced slightly out of sync. A simple phrase expands into a complex, overlapping rhythmic system. While Reich manipulated acoustic timing, the definitive leap into electric manipulation arrived through musique concrète. Composers began using magnetic tape to physically splice and manipulate everyday sounds, arranging them into formal compositions. The classical toolkit had expanded. Any sound produced in the mechanical world could now serve as a building block for a symphony. Dismantling the rigid European rules of the 19th century also shattered the orchestral color barrier, allowing the music to reflect a truer portrait of humanity. William Grant Still, known as the Dean of African American Composers, made history with his Afro-American Symphony. He proved that traditional symphonic structures could seamlessly integrate the rhythmic cadences of jazz and blues. That boundary-breaking legacy tracked forward to George Walker, who became the first African American to win the Pulitzer Prize for Music in 1996 for his deeply emotional work, Lyric for Strings. Meanwhile, Julius Eastman pushed late 20th century minimalism even further, challenging classical norms with his provocative, avant-garde approach. By integrating these uniquely American influences, these composers redrew the boundaries of the canon to include the perspectives it had previously ignored. Today, we live in the mosaic. The fragmented shards of the 20th century have been reassembled into a completely borderless musical landscape. Contemporary virtuosos like Jesse Montgomery operate at the vanguard of this era, writing compositions that bridge classical, jazz, and folk into a single unified sound. Artists like RZA traverse these lines even further, bringing the architecture of hip-hop directly into the concert hall. His composition, A Ballet Through Mud, proves that the walls separating classical music from popular contemporary genres have been demolished. In the 21st century, the term classical denotes a boundless medium capable of absorbing any cultural influence. We have moved from strict romantic traditions to wedging metallic objects between the violently vibrating strings of a prepared piano. We have integrated digital synthesis and modern sampling straight into the repertoire, and we place these innovations right next to the sweeping collective power of a massive string section moving in chaotic unison. This medium remains a living, breathing project, perpetually absorbing new influences. Classical music shattered its own internal rules to become a direct and accurate reflection of the modern world.